Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. If you see a missed call from someone named Diane Vale, break your phone. The phone didn't actually ring. That I'm sure of. I carelessly picked up my phone and scanned the notifications. Like all other, normal human beings in North America, I check my cell every 15 minutes for that sweet dopamine rush that comes with the notification of a new text or Snapchat message. I was pretty surprised when I saw that I had a missed call from 20 minutes ago. After all, my phone had been sitting in front of me on the table the whole time. And it usually emits an obnoxiously loud notification ping anytime anything happens. The thought that I missed my ringtone of Natalie Imbruglia's Torn playing Leave Me Alone. I chose it half ironically, was surprising. I checked the notification, assuming it was most likely spam, and was surprised to see that the call came from my local area code and that it even had a real-life name attached to it. Usually when I get a scam call telling me that Interpol has me on a watch list and that they'll lock me up forever unless I pay $213 via a very shady e-transfer. It's from a private caller. This time, there was a name. Diane Vale. It was still most likely a spam call. But I had been recently playing some modest gigs and opening for up-and-coming artists with my band. And I'd made sure to hand out my music business card, don't judge me, like candy at this point. I figured it wouldn't hurt to call back with this small, exciting but irrational, what if, thought in the back of my mind. And so I did. After a few rings, I heard someone answer the phone. "Hello?" asked the voice on the other end, sounding almost concerned, curious. "Is that an old lady?" I said, weakly. "I'm calling because I think I have a missed call from this number. From 20-ish minutes ago?" "Oh, is that right? Wow," she started, her voice weathered and hoarse. "Yep, definitely an old lady. I'm so sorry. I must have misdialed. Duh, I forgive you." I thought to myself. Cell phones are a lot, even for me sometimes. As much as I wanted to take this opportunity to ask this woman what her experience with TikTok was, to see if the question would melt her brain, I figured it was good to end the call here. "No worries at all. I hope you have a great day." "Why, thank you, dear," she said, and before I could press that bright red icon with the retro phone handle to sever all ties with this woman for the rest of my life, she quickly squeaked in right after. "I was trying to reach my husband." "Yes, that's what it was. He must have a similar number to you." "Oh, right. Yeah. I imagined you were probably just off by a digit or two." "Happens all the time," I said, still ready to hang up immediately. "Yes, that's what it was. I was trying to reach my husband. But I called you instead. Which means I wasn't able to reach my husband." "That is right, you wonderful sweet old lady. I think therefore I am. You called me. Therefore you didn't call your husband. Logic. I will try him again now. Thank you for being so sweet and tender about this," she continued. "Again. No worries at all," I said, hanging up right after to avoid her throwing more mind-blowing revelations my way. Like if I was on the phone with her. That means I wasn't on the phone with someone else right now. Whoa. Despite my snark, at the time I thought the whole exchange was actually a bit sweet. That was the prevailing thought. Anyways, when I saw her name show up on my caller ID a week later, to the sweet, sweet tunes of Natalie Imbruglia, Screw You, the song's a banger, I decided to answer. Hello? I said. Diane took a while to respond this time. She almost seemed surprised when she did. Wait, you're not Martin. Nope. I think this must be a wrong number. The revelation approached Diane at a glacial pace. Eventually, it clicked for her, and she answered with certainty. Ah, you must be the same woman I called last time. My, your voice sounds so clear. Yep, it's me again. Well, my goodness. You must be fuming that I accidentally reached out to you again. Not at all, ma'am. You're all good. Best of luck reaching your husband. Oh, well, it's not my husband this time actually. It's my brother I'm trying to call. Gotcha. Well, best of luck. I gotta run. I hung up the call just as she was mid-sentence through her response. I felt rude doing it. But at the same time, you have to nip things like this in the bud immediately before they drag out. If someone on a cold call or on the street asks you for 20 seconds of your time, be stern, say no and move on. It's the foot in the door technique, and I had to quash it before she felt empowered to share a series of boring stories with me. It wasn't until nighttime that same day that I realized it was pretty weird that she contacted me on another misdialed call. This time after trying to reach her brother. Did her husband, her brother, and I all have very similar phone numbers or something? I pushed the thought aside and moved on. And after 2 weeks of no misdials, I'd assumed that she'd moved on too. It turns out that the third time was the charm actually. And this time, Diane's reappearance was only frustrating and nothing else. I heard the tail end of my ringtone playing, "You're a little late." I'm already torn, at what must have been 2 a.m. in the morning. I got up just as my phone stopped ringing and checked who the call had come from. Motherfucking Diane again. Except this time it wasn't just this one missed call. It was 20. She'd been trying me for over an hour and I just slept through all of it apparently. I blocked her number and went back to bed. In the morning, I'd noticed that she'd also sent some voicemails. Out of morbid, annoyed curiosity, I decided to give them a listen. I expected to hear a mundane series of messages about her day, an incident at the bank, a complaint that oranges at the supermarket cost 20 cents more than usual, or her frustration that her husband and brother still weren't answering her calls. Instead, as I listened, every voicemail was the same. Breathing. Just her breathing. One voicemail after another. Continuous. Running for minutes each time before cutting out to the next message. Occasionally, it felt as if her breathing would rupture, like she was just about to start crying. But she never did. What in the ever-loving fuck? I wasn't sure if I should have been creeped out or if I should have felt really bad. Regardless, I was able to rationalize all of this again. She clearly was just terrible with technology. And the line, "Leave your message after the beep," meant nothing to her. Never mind the fact that answering machines had been a thing for a really long time before the advent of voicemail, so she really must have been living under a rock to have missed all of that. I decided to run with my half-baked explanation for the purposes of buttoning all of this up in my head as quickly as possible. Thanks to me blocking her number, the next couple of months were business as usual. All was normal in my world. Yes, I would still get a strange sinking feeling in my stomach every time I thought about Diane's series of late-night calls. But overall, the hustle and bustle of everyday life allowed me to put the incident behind me. Then, on a not-so-special day at a not-so-special time, my phone started ringing. I instinctively went to pick it up as I was actually awaiting a call from one of my friends at that moment. I almost had an aneurysm when I saw the name, Diane Vale, on the caller ID. My curiosity on how she'd overridden me blocking her number was quickly quashed when I realized that her number looked way different this time. It definitely wasn't from my local area code. She changed numbers to reach me? I answered the phone. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with you, but stop fucking calling me. I'm completely alone. She interrupted. Her interjection stumped me momentarily. I'm alone. She continued. I heard you. My husband, my brother, my family and friends. They've all passed. I have no one. I'm completely isolated. Look, I'm sorry to hear that. Really. But that's no excuse. I just need someone to talk to. Please. Just one meaningful conversation. And then you won't need to hear from me anymore. God damn it. Okay, I replied. As weird as this whole ordeal was, seriously. Calling a stranger because you're lonely under the pretense that it was just a wrong number? If getting her to talk about the heartache that comes with growing old alone and losing everyone you love was enough to put her at ease, then I could probably burn 10 minutes for it. Secretly, I was more frustrated at the potential kids, grandkids, or extended family that this woman may have had who'd left her all alone with no emotional or social support. Sometimes it feels like I've always been alone. She started, and yet, I have memories of a time when life was full. There was company, laughter, liveliness. I can distinctly remember moments where it felt like I had almost done too much socializing, where the presence of others was almost overbearing. If you could believe it. You don't say? Ah, in hindsight, what a strange, foolish thought for me to have had. She mused, her voice trailing off. I decided to multitask. I had a concert later in the evening, and I figured I could put her on speakerphone and start getting ready. I went to the bathroom, placed my phone on the countertop next to the sink, and started doing my makeup in front of the mirror. I'm sure that reminiscing on the past probably brings back some mixed feelings. I'm sorry to hear that you feel alone nowadays. No old friends or extended family around for you to talk to? I asked her. No, everyone I've been close to has passed. Damn. That really does suck. I tried to approach the conversation from a new angle, while applying eyeliner. Might be a strange question, but is there any way for you to try to make some new friends? You think? Or do you have any kids or grandkids that you could try to reach out to maybe? I've tried. With my kids. No luck. They never answer. That's a shame. I replied. But on the topic of new friends, yes. Absolutely. I would certainly love to make some new friends. That's good, I said, but as I spoke, something felt off. I felt a chill going up my spine. Like, something inside me, some inner barrier, had just been broached. It's a hard feeling to describe. I hope you can find some way to feel empowered. I continued, shaking off the weird feeling. To make some new friends. And to get everything you still can out of life. You should never give up on making your life a fulfilling one. You know, even when the circumstances aren't great. Man, I was really pulling out all of the platitudes today. Never, never ever. I've always been persistent. I've never been one to give up hope on having and maintaining a wonderful life. Not a chance. Not in a million years. She responded with conviction. I tried to focus on her words and the conversation, but I kept getting distracted. I noticed the strangest thing in the mirror. My free hand was caressing my hair slowly. In a really strange way. Why am I doing that? I returned my arm to its normal resting position and went back to dabbing on some concealer under my eyes. But every time I feel hopeful, I sink into sadness again. It truly is the worst thing to lose your family. I'm really sorry to hear that. I responded. I meant it. It was a brutal accident. We were all in the car. It was my brother driving. He'd had this brief moment of negligence. He was distracted in conversation and had turned his gaze away from the road. And it was at that same time that another driver in another car had a moment of recklessness. It was a perfect accident, almost like the opposite of serendipity. Two momentary lapses leading to a terrible cosmic mistake. I was caressing my cheek. Wait, why was I caressing my cheek? Yes, my skin is amazing, but I don't usually feel compelled to touch it like that. I brought my free hand back to its resting position yet again. That's fucked up. I'm truly sorry about that. And just so I'm following. That accident is how you lost your brother. Everyone. My brother was driving. His wife was beside him in the passenger seat. And in the back of the car. It was myself, my husband, and my sister. Jesus. That's fucking brutal. Excuse my language. I'm genuinely so sorry. I can't even imagine how it'd feel to survive something like that. And have to go on while losing the closest people to you. You know? No answer from her for a little bit. Just her breathing. Must have been emotional for her to recall all of that. I could sense that we were probably going a bit too deep. And at this point, I was ready to wind things down. I wasn't even sure if this conversation was gonna do any good for her anyways. And so I started thinking about ways I could wrap up this civic duty I'd undertaken. It's a void, she said. Yeah, I totally get that. We probably don't want to get into it too much. But I've lost people close to me too, and it definitely feels like it's a hole in your. Where you end up when it all ends is a void. It's not at all what people said it would be. What? Also, my involuntary movements were really starting to wig me out now. It almost felt like I was suffering from a concussion or something. 1 minute I was standing up straight, swiping on some lipstick. The next I was leaning over the sink with my face nearly pressed against the mirror, staring deep into my own eyes. It was time to end the call. I'm really sorry to hear that. And I feel terrible about everything you've had to go through. I really hope you can find some peace and solace. I unfortunately have to go though. If that's okay. You know, she continued, my words breezing past her. When the crash happened, even though I felt my skull crack, and my spine snap, and blood fill my mouth, choking me while the rest of me remained a mangled mess, it still felt like I was alive for much longer than I should have been. It hurt for a really long time. Fuck that. I'm out. I felt a movement come from within me. I was pushing my hair back, but I wasn't doing it. But then I thought, when I'd finally crossed over, that I'd be connected with everyone again. We would all be together. But it wasn't true. It's just a void. It's darkness. A sea of it. And it's lonely and horrifying. And yet the hopelessness is paired with a strange vigor. A real want to return back to life. I went to hang up the phone. Why are my hands violently clasped together? Easy now. I can feel you. Stay on a little while longer. I'm almost there, she said. Oh fuck. I'm ready to move on from this. I'm ready to start a new life. Make new friends again. Walk down the street and hear the noise of cars and casual conversations. Company. Why do I feel like I'm about to pass out? Why do I feel like there's something blossoming from me? I am so thrilled you called back and kept answering, because I swear to you this has all happened for a reason, and I'm almost there, and I am almost completely inside of you, and you are so beautiful and young, and I can already imagine with real vividness the friends I'm going to meet and the new memories I'm going to make, and just the liveliness of it all. And everything. Even through the pain. It all means something. I am utterly convinced about that fact. Her speech started to become more rapid, more intense. I could hear it in my head. I was trying to unclasp my hands and hang up the call, but I couldn't overpower it. Stay on just a little longer, dear. I'm almost there and I feel myself taking over ya, this wonderful feeling. I spoke through clenched teeth as I felt myself blacking out. Get the fuck away from my body, I growled. In an instant, something deep in my gut told me that I was only a few seconds away from losing myself completely. So, with a strange burst of instinct, I smashed my head against the bathroom mirror, breaking it. My hands were still clenched together forcefully. It didn't feel like her spirit inside me had weakened in the slightest. So I braced myself for more. What an unkind and selfish thing to do to my body, she shouted. But I cut her off by slamming my head against the wall. I did it again and again. But I could still hear her fucking voice croaking over the phone. I pushed through, this time making sure I didn't hold back. With a wind up, I smashed my head as hard as I could against the bathroom counter. It hurt like a motherfucker. As soon as I recoiled from the impact, I was afraid that I'd done some irreversible damage to my skull or my brain. But it didn't matter. I had a sense of vigor of my own. I'd rather be dead than have anyone else in my body. I felt her impact on me weaken ever so slightly, as her voice came through the call. You're a vessel, she said. Why can't you be grateful for that? I could feel myself on the brink of losing consciousness. I wasn't sure if it was from the head trauma I'd incurred, or if my spirit was about to slip away. But I pushed as hard as I could one last time. I stood up and brought my head down like a hammer onto the counter where the phone lay, knocking it, and myself, down to the ground. Amidst the excruciating pain and confusion, I felt the sensation of freedom for a few seconds. I leveraged the brief lucidity that came with the insane amount of adrenaline in me and crawled over to the phone. I tapped through the screens and notifications in an almost deranged manner. Just as I heard Diane about to say something else, I hung up the call. Jesus fucking Christ. It's fucking done. I screamed in place on the bathroom floor for what must have been a minute. I screamed even louder when I heard my Natalie Imbruglia ringtone play to signify another incoming call. Caller ID. Diane Vale. I hung up the call immediately, but it was interrupted by another call. Then another, and another. Diane was calling simultaneously from different numbers. Over and over again. each call interrupting the previous one before I even had the chance to hang up. I ran to my hallway closet, found my toolbox, opened it, secured a hammer, and ran back into the bathroom. Without a second's hesitation, I smashed my Samsung Galaxy S23 to pieces. Even after I'd destroyed it, I continued banging the hammer into my bathroom floor, getting all of the bullshit and headache out of my system. And then I was done. I stood up slowly. The mirror was broken, so I could only imagine how bruised and battered my reflection looked. With the adrenaline subsiding, the insane amount of pain I felt over my body became ever more apparent. Like Diane had said, it hurt for a really long time. But I was still here, and it was probably time for me to go to the hospital. No concert tonight. Probably for the best. I could explain to the cops later why I was screaming while trashing my own bathroom. It took me a while to feel comfortable getting a new phone. I still remember the puking sensation I felt months ago when I saw her name pop up again on caller ID, this time. Off my new ringtone, Electric Light Orchestra's Evil Woman. I blocked it, which is what I did with every other number permutation she used to call me as the months continued. The skin-crawling sensation every time she tried to reach me was always the same. But, thankfully, as time passed, her calls started becoming fewer and farther between. Maybe she was starting to make peace with the void. Or, alternatively, she was using that spare time to finally learn how to text from the great beyond. I got my first texts from her a few weeks back. "You were so unbelievably selfish. To string me along, give me false hope, and then back out at the last moment. I have a silent prayer that I'm holding deep in my heart. That when you do pass, you'll be in the same void I am. I'll have an eternity to inflict on you what I dream about in every waking moment. Diane." Sigh. Not even an XOX or a TTYL. She needs to brush up on her texting etiquette. At the time, I laughed and thought it was stupid. Lady, if we all end up in a void, and you've already been seemingly alone in said void for what's felt like an eternity, then it's probably safe to say that it's a big fucking void where you won't ever find me. That's the prevailing thought I like to keep. But every now and then I do sink into a bit of despair. Specifically, in the mornings when I wake up after a nightmare. All of my nightmares nowadays seem to take on the same tone. It's a regular ass dream. And then out of nowhere, I turn a corner and off in the distance, the dream extends into a black void. And standing on the edge of the void, where the darkness meets my normal dream surroundings, is Diane. She's looking at me with an intense stare and a subtle smile. And she's waving. And for that brief moment, it all feels unbelievably real and vivid. The thing I hate the most about these nightmares is how my body caves sometimes. Every now and then, involuntarily, I'll catch myself waving back. I wonder if we're allowed to bring things with us into the afterlife. If so, I'd like to ask my loved ones to bury me with a hammer. Story. My daughter is a serial killer. I just found out she may be something much worse. My daughter is a serial killer. It took me a long time to be able to say this. Long after the police came to her house when we were visiting. After they found the graveyard in an abandoned field behind her house. Bodies arranged in 3 wide circles like some kind of macabre fairy rings. After they told us just how many people she had killed, a number so high, I cannot even begin to understand how she managed it at 29. It was 2 years after she was put on death row I finally said those words to my wife. Our daughter is a serial killer. People always say female serial killers were rare and not as bad as male serial killers. But Fiona was right up there with Bundy and Dahmer when it came to the brutality of her kills. She was no less violent, depraved or cruel. The collection of her victims' hearts she kept in her fridge was every indication of that, and so were the coroner's reports that each victim had been kept alive for days. Tortured, starved before Fiona finally killed them. It was a mercy in the end for them. Death. Nobody would want to live in the aftermath of what she did. The cop told me that the coroner had been gray when she said this. That in 25 years of policing work he had never seen anything this awful. Some nights I still wake up in terror from nightmares of what she did. The strangest thing about all this was that Fiona was a tiny little thing. The police were utterly flummoxed as to how she had managed to do any of this. Worse still, they couldn't figure out just how she had killed these people. The cuts were so clean, like a surgeon's hand, but there was nothing in the world that could have made these cuts. No scalpel or knife. All their organs had been removed and then they had been neatly stitched back up again. When they opened the stitches up, they found the insides of the victims had been tattooed with hundreds of lines in a language no one could decipher. My daughter is not a medical professional. She is not a tattoo artist. She only speaks 2 languages, English and Spanish. We avoided the press, but that didn't mean the articles wouldn't be written. And the articles came. Articles where they questioned what kind of childhood she had, what kind of parents we were. They dug through everything about our family and were probably disappointed to find that we were your run-of-the-mill, all-American family, so they made things up through speculation. Perhaps we were too boring. Perhaps the normalcy was the problem. Or perhaps we were just very good at covering our tracks. Either way, the fallout was that my wife and I lost our jobs. We were accosted on the streets. Our tires were flattened multiple times and 3 times have had to remove graffiti from the sides of our house calling us unspeakable things. My son couldn't handle it. He and his wife had to change their names and leave the state. We couldn't do that though. Who would visit Fiona in prison if we left? I know people wanted to think Fiona was an oddball, that these killer tendencies had manifested in her because she was weird. A loner of sorts. No, Fiona was a popular kid. She was a great daughter. Never missed a chance to come visit and help us. She was a cheerleader and did well in school. She had a group of friends she grew up with. She even married her childhood sweetheart. I can't say she was a good wife, however. Poor James. They found his head in the chest freezer in their basement. They still haven't found his body. It was the first time we visited her in prison that led me to finding what was in the attic. We were asked to try to get more information out of her. The police said that there were bodies they couldn't identify yet and that if we could get her to talk, it would help bring some peace to the victims' families. They also wanted to know how she did it. The guilt of what our child had done to other people's children made us go more than our love for our daughter. It felt like some small way of atonement, finding out what we could and helping in some way. Not that anything could make amends for giving birth to a monster. It happened on the day of the visit. We sat nervously and waited in a highly secure room within the most high-security prison. 2 wardens stood within the room with us. 2 stood outside and 4 wardens escorted Fiona, in chains, to us. When the door opened and our daughter walked in, what was alarming was to see the jovial smile on her face despite being chained at both her hands and feet. She looked remarkably well. This wasn't surprising since she had smiled coldly her entire way through the trial as well, but there was something extra obscene about how well prison suited her. She was glowing. "Hi, Dad, Mom." She sat down across the table from us. I flinched as the sound of the chains as they clinked when she moved. Fiona, my wife, Christina, managed, her hand clutched right around a tissue. Then she was crying again and Fiona's face changed a bit. She looked at Christina in concern. "Mom, please don't cry. If you knew what I know, you wouldn't be upset." Anger began to bubble up inside me. What the hell was wrong with Fiona? I had read enough now to know that serial killers were devoid of empathy or human emotions in general, but this wasn't the little girl I had raised to be a good woman. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice quiet as I tried to keep the emotion out of it. "Why did you kill all those people?" Fiona sat back smiling and tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Oh, Dad, it doesn't matter. You can't stop us, no matter how much you try." I couldn't understand what she was talking about. "Fiona, my patience was wearing extremely thin." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your father, Dad, and his father, and his father. All those generations." I swallowed hard and glanced at the prison warden. If he felt like something was weird about our conversation, he didn't show it. However, "What about them?" I asked her, concern edging its way into my voice. Fiona tilted her head quizzically and for a moment I saw her as a 6-year-old. Doing that when I taught her maths. "Do you really not remember?" I shifted uneasily in my seat. "You know what this is. You have always known," she said, leaning forward. "I really. We don't like it when you lie." I stammered and then fell silent. I didn't know what kind of game she was playing. She sat back and smiled brightly. "Then I swear to you my heart stopped." Suddenly the entire room darkened. Fiona's eyes went completely black. Her skin and hair turned pale white. And yet the guards kept standing there, seemingly seeing nothing. Frozen in time. I tried to look at Christina, but she just sat there, staring ahead of her into nothingness. A tear frozen on her cheek. My daughter opened her mouth and ash fell out as she spoke. Her replaced by a deep, cold one. "Elaman zarote koikai eade saplura. Tenu devet okpia ed misdu. Aladi gadara devet ga orif uru kidori." Those words, I knew those words. I had seen them before. My hands cold and clammy. I pushed back from the table as the chair fell away and backed myself up against a wall. Terror gripping my chest. Instantly, the scene was back to normal. My daughter's face was normal. My wife's shoulders shuddered as she sobbed, still unable to speak a word, and Fiona sat there with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Shaking, I told the guard, "We are done here." My wife turned to look at me and I stared into her teary eyes. "We need to go, now." The last thing we heard as we left the room was Fiona's laughter. Once vibrant, now cold and cruel. When we got home, I waited until dinner was over and we went up to bed. I waited until Christina had taken her sleeping pill and her breathing was even enough to know she was asleep. Then, I quietly got up and made my way to the attic. I knew exactly what I was looking for. After I hauled myself up from the square-shaped opening in our ceiling into the dark, quiet room I hadn't visited since we had moved into this house, I shone my torch around. Mostly the room was full of the children's old toys and clothes. Things we had been planning to give away and never got around to. Old furniture that belonged to our parents. But there, hiding in the corner of the room was the cardboard box I was looking for, the reason I had not been in this attic for years. My mouth a bit dry and my hands trembling, I walked over to it and dragged it over to myself. Then I took a deep breath and opened it. Lying inside was a series of old, leather-bound journals I had hoped I would never ever have to look at again. It was the names and detailed torture and murders of every person my family had killed. The bloody and brutal legacy of the witchfinder generals that we used to be. Except, there were no witches. You already know this if you know anything about the witch trials. What witchfinder generals were hunting was much, much more ancient. They were hunting the old gods. You see, this world belonged to the ancient ones long before it became our home. It belonged to beings that were so powerful. They terrified us. But slowly as the world changed and less people believed in folk tales, so did they stop believing in the tales of the old gods. And what are gods without prayer and fear to keep them powerful and immortal? So they began to live amongst us to adapt to their mortality. Less powerful, less able to protect themselves. And we used that adaptation against them. We hunted them in the name our own God. We told ourselves that this is what needed to be done to keep our species safe. That we were servants of God doing His bidding. My family carried this tradition on for years, finding what was left of the ancient ones and decimating them. All the way till my father was born and refused to train in the ways of his father. My father killed his father when he was only a teenager. He was trying to protect a girl who would later become his wife. My mother, he kept the journals. He kept them to tell me of the history he was ashamed of. To tell me that I must never go down this route. I had read them years ago and shuddered at the amount of lives my family had stolen. And I never had. I had lived a good life and raised a good family. Or so I had thought. I turned the yellowed old sheets, reading name after name in faded ink. Finally, I found the thing I was looking for. It was there in the third journal. The last words of an ancient goddess that was burned alive. Elaman zarote koikai eade saplura. Tenu Devid Okpia ed Masdu. Aladi Gadara Devid Ga or if Uru Kidori. As I spoke the words aloud, recognizing now that they were not in a language no one understand but a language no human was supposed to understand. I saw them change slowly into English. For every one of us you kill, we will take 1,000 of you in return. Our vengeance will speak through your own blood. But the thing that made my blood run cold were the words Fiona had not said. The words that were below the ones I had just read. Sitting there written in faded old ink were the words, "Fear not your death, but what awaits every one of you after." Story. My grandpa was a prison guard. And he told me the horrible things he witnessed there. My grandfather was always kind of a dick. I know that's probably not the most kosher thing to say about a close family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would agree. He was a stone-faced man, never showed much emotion, and always had a fuse about as short as the balding gray hair atop his scalp. He wore a seemingly perpetual scowl upon his face and a narrowed brow that seemed to sneer with that get the hell off my lawn energy that only a proud boomer could properly muster. I remember one summer my family went out to visit him and my grandma, only for him to chastise my older sister for gaining a bit of weight. It of course made her cry and quickly devolved into a huge family drama that may never have been fully resolved. In stark contrast, my grandma was the most loving and kind person I've ever known. So when she passed a few years ago, it really struck my whole family hard. The funeral was a sordid affair, with my grandfather remaining distant the entire time, and not bothering to say a word on her behalf. The rest of the family gave eulogies and tried commemorating her the best we could. But Grandpa seemed not to notice or care either way. Once the ceremony concluded, most of the guests dispersed from the church. As the attendees thinned, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was seated up at the front, and although I didn't necessarily want to talk with him, I felt as though I should. "Hey Grandpa, I'm really sorry for your loss." He turned to me, a look of spite etched upon his face. He seemed to take note of my expression and his faltered into a sigh. "Thanks buddy, tough day for all of us." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowed hard. In that moment I saw my grandfather in a way I never had before. He was broken and vulnerable, newly alone in the world and clearly struggling to come to terms with it. I felt for him, and although we've never had the best relationship, I very much wanted to try and be there for him. Grandpa rose from his seat and approached the casket. He put a hand down upon it, speaking softly under his breath. "Don't worry, darlin', I'm right behind you." Grandpa and I talked a bit more, and eventually I decided he could use some company for the night. Although he was off-putting as a person, he was family. There was also something I always found interesting about him. There was something about him that always enthralled me. Despite his cold exterior, I knew there was more to him than just mean for mean's sake. Either way, no one should have to mourn alone, and so I decided to join him for dinner. After the ceremony concluded, I left the church and went to the store and picked us up some fresh steaks, golden potatoes and asparagus. I figured cooking him a good meal was the least I could do considering the difficult circumstances. My grandparents' old home was considerably more worn and overgrown than last I'd seen it as I pulled my car into the driveway. Of course, it was understandable considering the situation, but the difference was stark. It had been well over a decade since last I'd been out there, and although vaguely familiar, the wear and tear made it seem foreign. Grandpa welcomed me at the front door, and the two of us went into the backyard as he fired up the grill. It was a bit awkward at first, but after a beer or two we started opening up little more to one another. I told him about my life, fiancé and work, and he seemed genuinely interested in it. We talked a while as the steaks grilled, but I realize not many are reading this to hear about my fated reunion with my estranged grandfather. This is a horror sub after all, and as such it's probably best I just cut to the chase. Grandpa worked in prison rehabilitation for the entirety of his career. He began at just 18 years old as a prison guard, and eventually worked his way up to warden, which he presided as up until his retirement several years ago. I asked him which prison he worked for, but he sort of avoided the question. Boy, that's gotta be a tough line of work. Huh? I floated the question out, and he paused to ponder it. He swished the beer in his bottle before shrugging. You get used to it. Like anything, I suppose. But it'd be a lie to call it easy. Always gotta be on your toes, anticipating things to pop off at any moment. Never know what to expect, really. He told me a few stories he had from his long tenure of corrections. He almost seemed overly eager to talk about them, and it made me realize he probably didn't have anyone else to tell them to. He was a bit of loner after all, and it made me feel for him that his wife and likely only real human connection in the world was now gone. The two of us ate our dinner and continued chatting about his work in the prison industry and the miasma of experiences he was subjected to there. He had plenty of light-hearted stuff about coworkers and various interactions with inmates. But his tone seemed hampered. I don't know how to explain it, but it was likely there was something else that bothered him, and I decided to try and coax it out of him. You probably saw some messed up things there too. Huh? Grandpa sat back in thought, his pale white beard partially obscuring his disconcerted grimace. He then chuckled and clasped his hands together on his lap. Yeah, you could say that, as I'd hoped. He then delved into a few stories about stabbings, attempted breakouts and attacks on prison personnel. He had no shortage of rather gruesome events to recall. But of course there was one which dwarfed them all. Then there were the experiments. My interest peaked as soon as he said that. He paused then, his head slowly swiveling on his shoulders. Experiments? Yeah, or clinical trials, I suppose. They can sugarcoat them however they like, but that don't change the reality. Far as I know, they never even published the findings, and I'm not surprised. He was clearly a bit reticent to divulge the details, and I didn't want to push him on it. The admission alone seemed to hang like a weight on his neck, dragging his posture down and his eyes into fog. If there is a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. Grandpa said he had been working at the prison for a good 2 decades when these experiments began. By then he was the lead guard on shift, and essentially second in command to the presiding warden at the time. Grandpa was summoned by the warden one day for an impromptu meeting. Or so he thought. As he entered the room, he found the warden with 2 other men in his office. The 2 men were well dressed in blue suede suits with polished black wingtips. Both had neatly combed hair and beards with stark blue eyes. The warden introduced them to Grandpa as Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, but did not elaborate who they were or what organization they worked for. No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got confirmation either way. Grandpa explained. Apparently the 2 men had already struck a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was to be a part of it as well. They explained they were conducting an experiment to test the limits of the human psyche. They explained that all Grandpa would have to do was the same thing he'd been doing for 20 years. Guard the cells, and ensure there were no complications with the inmates. The deal came with a substantial financial bonus, one which nearly doubled Grandpa's salary that year. But of course, he knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money. He just shook his head solemnly as he said it. These experiments would go on to be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The idea was a simple one: take 5 prisoners and put them into solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's crew would monitor them and conduct research as they saw fit. The 2 men explained it was important research to determine the harmful effects on the human psyche to further understanding of the brain. But Grandpa saw through it. It was cruel, it was inhumane, and by the end it was a crime against humanity. They knew that from the beginning. But they also knew no one would speak on the behalf of those they chose. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they volunteered for a reduced sentence, but Grandpa knew that was a lie. To put it simply, the 5 chosen were among the worst offenders currently imprisoned. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged white male who had been convicted of multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault against minors. He'd been sentenced to 57 years and had served just 4 up to that point. Prisoner 2 was an elderly white male who had been convicted of the rape, murder and mutilation of 6 different female sex workers over the span of 9 years. He'd been given 3 life sentences, and was the longest currently incarcerated inmate in the entire prison. Prisoner 3 was a black male responsible for the stabbing murder of an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson as a result of a home invasion. He'd been sentenced to capital punishment, and had been on death row for almost 5 years awaiting his fate. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged Hispanic male who had once served as a hitman for a notorious drug gang. He'd been convicted of executing 8 people and disposing of their remains during his tenure. Though many believe his body count was much higher, Prisoner 5 was actually the only inmate that wasn't currently incarcerated at my grandpa's prison. He was brought in from another prison, but Grandpa was never able to get a hold of his file to see where he was transferred from or what he was actually in for. He described the guy as a young, very skinny white male with long black hair and evil eyes. Grandpa said he locked eyes with the guy once, and only once, viscerally rattled by the experience. The cells in which the participants were to be housed were in an isolated wing of the prison deep underground. Each cell had to be retrofitted with a number of augmentations which were completed by Smith and Johnson's crew. It took them almost a full year to do it, but once they were done, the cells were unlike any others, entirely soundproof from the inside, and entirely devoid of light. Cameras equipped with both infrared and night vision lens were installed upon the ceiling of each cell to monitor the occupants 24/7. Finally, the renovations were completed and the cells were ready to fulfill their grim purpose. One by one, Grandpa and his team escorted the men into each of the cells. Most went quietly without a word spoken. Grandpa theorized that the men were given promises of commuting their sentences which helped ensure their compliance. But this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked non-stop throughout the trek to the cell, asking all manner of questions about a variety of things. Grandpa and his men just remained silent. Inmate 5 was mostly silent during the transport as well, his long dark hair covering his face the entire way. At several points, Grandpa swore he heard the guy giggle under his breath. He said it sounded like a kid's laugh, and that obviously didn't make him feel any better. The guy went into his cell without protest, and as his door shut, the trials had officially begun. All the lights in the block were extinguished, and the outer soundproof doors were shut. Each cell was separated far from one another to prevent the inmates from being able to communicate verbally. From there, all the supervising team had to do was wait and watch. Grandpa simply went back to his duties then, checking in periodically on Smith and Johnson's team but never venturing into the cell block. The inmates were to have no contact with the outside world whatsoever, and no exposure to light of any kind. Small slots in the walls were used to distribute food and water, and the inmates were well fed with good hearty meals, unlike the majority of the other inmates in the prison. Grandpa continually emphasized how uncomfortable he was with the whole thing, even from the get-go. "Why didn't you say anything?" I bit my tongue as the words left my lips, worried I would offend him. Grandpa just sighed, his shoulders slumped as his lips pursed. It's hard to speak on behalf of those you detest, even if you know they are being wrong. There was a profound truth to his words, and it made me take pause as he added another thought. It's not an acceptable excuse, but he just trailed off there, shaking his head and sighing. After just a few days of seclusion, the inmates were already struggling quite a lot. Inmate 2 had been crying periodically, while 3 showed signs of severe paranoia. The other 3 remained mostly silent. 5 was the most unnerving, however, sitting almost entirely motionless for the entire day aside from sleeping. 4 tried to keep himself busy doing calisthenics like push-ups and sit-ups, while 1 mostly just laid around in various positions, slipping in and out of consciousness. On the eve of day 5, inmate 2 had slammed his head into the side of the cell and began bleeding from his nose and mouth. After the impact, he fell and convulsed for several seconds on the ground as blood dripped from him. He fell still, and my grandpa anticipated them conducting a medical intervention. But they never did. They just continued to monitor as inmate 2 was left to his own devices. Later that same day, an inmate 3 suddenly screamed. He began scrambling around his cell blind, slamming into walls and babbling incoherently. "There's something in here, man. Let me out." He shouted the words as tears poured from his eyes. He continued freaking out for a few more minutes until tiring himself out. He then collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily, staring upward to the top of the cell. He couldn't have seen it, but my grandpa swears he was staring directly into the feed of the camera. Inmate 1 began having conversations with himself, apparently acting as both parties on either side of the conversation. The things he discussed with himself began as asinine, even comical at times, but they quickly took a disturbing turn. He seemingly role-played conversations between a young boy and his father, and the things discussed turned Grandpa's stomach. He wouldn't repeat or even hint at them, but considering why inmate 1 was imprisoned in the first place, I can probably fill in the blanks. Inmate 1 then broke down, sobbing quietly as he held himself in the fetal position. My grandpa says this was the moment that really made him actually feel something for the inmates, and question what the hell he'd signed up for. These men did horrible things. Ain't no changing that, but even so, you come to realize how everyone has a story. Were they born monsters or were they made monsters? I won't pretend to understand how these things work, but what I do understand from one human being to another is the suffering of life. Things only got worse from there, and outbursts of screaming and sobbing became commonplace amongst all participants minus inmate 5. Alone in the silent darkness, They had nothing but their own minds to keep them company. And that company was clearly not bringing much comfort. Inmate 4 would often pantomime holding a gun, and seemingly acting out shootouts and conflicts in his cell. His breathing would increase and he'd be moving and ducking around the cell as though he were trying to avoid getting shot. Inmate 3 would shuffle around his cell, flinching randomly and at times collapsing to the ground as though someone had struck him. Inmate 2's condition had continued to deteriorate. Clearly, his head wound trauma had likely caused brain trauma, and he would regularly suffer seizures and fits of screaming at the top of his lungs. He refused to eat, and the food he was given began to pile up by the cell door. Some of the prison personnel wanted to retrieve him for medical assistance, but Smith and Johnson wouldn't allow it. They were told time and time again that no matter what happens to the inmates, they were not to intervene. By day 9, Inmate 2 was dead. He'd been laying motionless face down for nearly a full day when his passing was finally confirmed. As they rewound the footage to try and determine the time of death, they noticed something odd. As soon as Inmate 2's chest had stopped moving, Inmate 1 suddenly perked up. He then lifted his head and smiled, extending his hand to wave at something as though he were saying goodbye to an old friend. He, of course, had no way of communicating with Inmate 2 nor knowing he had passed. It was a weird event, but it was regarded as a simple coincidence. Inmate 1 continued to deteriorate after that, spending most of his time just sitting catatonic in his cell. Inmates 3 and 4 also continued to show signs of severe delusions and paranoia. Inmate 4 would randomly burst into fits of screaming as though he were threatening a rival before reverting to hysteric sobbing as he begged to be let out of the cell. At one point he punched the wall full force, shattering his fist into a mangled mess of flesh and bone. Contrary to the rest, Inmate 5 hardly ever made a peep. He would sit motionless in his cell for hours, hiding his face as he seemed to meditate. Every once in a while he'd look directly into the camera lens though, despite not being able to see it. My grandpa said he still gets chills picturing the way the guy smiled, and swears something about him was downright evil. "Let me ask you a question." Grandpa suddenly interrupted his tale. Behind the smoldering campfire I spied him staring down at his boots, swirling his whiskey in his glass. His eyes then drifted to me, an almost hesitant aura in his eyes. Is it evil to do evil things to evil people? I thought about it a moment, a cold chill slithering down my spine as I anticipated where this topic was headed. I wish I could say I came up with some profound response, but I didn't and still don't have one. In the end, I just shrugged and took a swig of my lager. Grandpa's expression then shifted, as though he were at a similar stalemate himself. I fear the day the world finds an answer to that question. Eventually, the team conducting the trial brought medical supplies to Inmate 4. As soon as the guard slid open the access port at the bottom of the door, Inmate 4 lunged for it. "Let me out, man, please. You gotta let me out, I'll do anything." He tried grabbing at the guard through the port, but the guard managed to retreat away. He then slammed his baton on the man's hands until he recoiled back inside. The guard flung the tray of food along with the medical supplies in after him and slid the port shut. Inmate 4 began to sob hysterically, switching between bargaining and yelling threats for nearly half an hour. He eventually seemed to wear himself out and collapsed in a heap in his cell. but not before muttering one final chilling phrase. "Please don't let it get me." Grandpa ended up working late that night, and just before he clocked out was when it happened. One of the other guards frantically called him to the monitor station. On the feed, Grandpa saw inmate 4 flailing around desperately and screaming. He said it seemed like something was attacking him. But of course, there was nothing else in there. By this point, the 2 station guards had already witnessed so many disturbing events that they wanted to intervene and help the guy. But Grandpa overruled them. His chest seemed to deflate as he admitted that. But in the end, all the 3 of them did was watch. Inmate 4 continued to wrestle around for several long minutes until finally falling flat on his back. He then began to grasp for his neck and appeared as though he believed someone was straddling his chest and choking him. He began to gurgle and cough, flailing desperately as his eyes bulged from their sockets. In under a minute, he let out a soft gasp as the strength drained from his body and he fell still. Never to move again. Once again. The moment Inmate 4 fell still, Inmate 1 perked up. Just as before, he then smiled and waved while staring in the direction of Inmate 4's cell. Despite not knowing where he was housed or even that he was there to begin with, Inmate 5 then suddenly perked up from his fetal position. His neck craned backwards, and head angled upwards, but his face seemed entirely devoid of emotion. "Please don't let it get me." He repeated the final words of Inmate 4 in a whisper. He, like Inmate 1, had no way of knowing nor hearing Inmate 4, and yet somehow repeated the exact same phrase. As the words left his mouth, his lips curled into a wide, almost inhuman smile. Grandpa described it as the look worn only by the most deranged of lunatics. Inmate 5 then erupted into a bellowing laugh which caused everyone in the observatory room to flinch. Grandpa said he was damn near scream laughing at the top of his lungs as his eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets. After a good full minute, he finally seemed to quiet as his calamitous laugh quieted to a hushed giggle. "Please don't let it get me." He then turned and once again glared directly into the hidden camera lens in his cell. Grandpa described that moment as feeling like he was staring into the eyes of the devil himself. He'd seen enough for that night, but before leaving, Smith caught up with Grandpa as he was about to head out. He first made casual conversation with him, before asking him a series of strange questions. "You ever see anything weird around here? How are you sleeping lately? You guys get a lot of inspections in this facility?" Grandpa didn't say much in response, just shrugging off most of the questions. Smith tried to coat his inquiries in a nonchalant manner, but Grandpa knew better. There was no way of hiding the dread which dripped from his every word. For Grandpa felt it too. The following morning, Grandpa got a call as he was preparing himself for his shift. The call was from a frantic coworker telling him they needed him there ASAP but didn't clarify what had happened. Grandpa arrived at the prison not long after, and was quickly ushered into the camera room. There he noticed that Inmate 5's cell was suddenly empty. Grandpa asked where Inmate 5 was and the solemn guards just guided his attention to the monitors. They replayed the recording from the previous night at just before 3 a.m. Grandpa watched mystified as 1 second Inmate 5 was seen sitting idle before suddenly just vanishing. There was no split in the feed, no movement of any kind. Just 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. Grandpa stared at the other two guards, but neither of them had any explanation for what had just happened. One of them suggested going into the cell to check it out firsthand, but none of them were eager to do that. Instead, they waited around spitballing theories until Johnson and Smith arrived along with the warden. Grandpa then informed them what had happened and showed them the video from inmate 5's cell the previous night. Grandpa said that was the first and only time he ever saw any emotion on their faces, and their reaction clearly conveyed their fear. "Lock the prison down now. No one comes in or goes out," Johnson commanded, and the befuddled warden sounded the alarm. Every single prisoner in the entire complex was returned to their cells. Grandpa and the other guards spent the next 12 hours combing every square inch of the prison. Despite their best efforts, not a single trace of inmate 5 was found. The search was eventually extended beyond the prison walls, but once again the attempt proved futile. Eventually, Smith and Johnson ventured in to search the seclusion cell block themselves. By this point, only inmates 1 and 3 were still alive in their cells. Neither of them reacted as the men entered the block. Inmate 1 continued just rocking back and forth mumbling, while inmate 3 appeared to be asleep. Smith and Johnson were in there for nearly an hour before returning defeated and stupefied. They didn't say much to the others, and by that point the entire staff was exhausted from the day's events. Grandpa and his crew were dismissed as the night crew took over. Grandpa said he had some of the worst nightmares of his life that night, and barely slept a wink despite being exhausted. When he returned to work the following day, he found the other members of his crew looking much the same. They were all summoned into the meeting room with the warden as they awaited their instructions. The warden then informed them that the experiment had been discontinued. The only surviving members of inmate 1 and 3 were to be returned to general population. Grandpa protested that decision, but was overruled. It turns out Grandpa was right to be worried, as neither inmate lasted long when back in the prison. Inmate 3 began behaving like a cornered animal, showing signs of paranoia and aggression. He got in multiple fights with other inmates, until one scuffle ended with him getting his head slammed into a bed. He ended up dying from severe cranial hemorrhage not long after. Inmate 1 was much more composed, but no less traumatized. He just kept to himself, refusing to eat and isolating himself from everyone. After about a week of his self-imposed starvation, Grandpa's team prepared to intervene. They found him dead in his cell the following morning. His body was taken for autopsy, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. Apparently, the fallout from this event caused the former warden of the prison to step down. My grandfather was named the new warden shortly thereafter, but a lot of the other guards ended up leaving as well. For a while, the management was worried about a potential legal investigation. But as time went on, there was nothing. They never heard from Smith or Johnson again, and in time people forgot. But Grandpa never did. He polished off the remainder of his beer and clasped his hands before him as he concluded his story. The campfire had been reduced to smoldering coals by then, and Grandpa's once serious demeanor appeared suddenly much more crestfallen. "We all do things we're not proud of. You know, we all make decisions for what we think is the best option. But sometimes we're wrong. I did it for the money, no denying it. But why did they do it? Smith and Johnson, whatever their real names were, why did they do it? His gray eyes drifted to me, as though he expected me to answer. More than likely he searched for any answer that could be offered. But I hadn't one to give. Did they ever find him? That prisoner that disappeared? Grandpa's head slowly swiveled side to side as his eyes seemed to deflate. As far as I know, he was never seen again. It was in that moment that I almost found myself skeptical. He'd told his story so well that I very nearly believed it. "You're fucking with me," I called him on it. But his face didn't falter an inch. He slowly turned to me with that cold, ironclad stare that he was renowned for. He didn't need to say anything in his defense, for his expression told me his words were true, and they had haunted him for a lifetime. How does that happen? How does someone just vanish into thin air? Grandpa shrugged at the question and massaged the back of his neck. He thought for a moment, then smirked, but refused to make eye contact. "If you can figure that one out, you let me know." He chuckled to himself, then crossed his arms. "There was one report years ago. This young gal was at home alone one night when someone tried to break into her house. Poor thing was scared stiff, and the description she gave of the man she'd seen seemed to match inmate 5. He met my bewildered stare as I hung on every word. "So the cops look around, but can't find anything." Things calmed down. Then about a month later, the same young lady vanishes, never seen again. Never solved. He paused once more, then scoffed as he adjusted his posture. "Course it's impossible, right? All of it is. That's what I'd say if someone told me. But yet I was there. I seen it." He fell silent once more as the two of us contemplated the prospect. I figured it best to allow him to convey his thoughts, and so I waited until he spoke again. "Maybe it's best we don't know. But there was one detail of that troubling story which really spooked me. There was a message written in blood on the front of her house." He paused and glanced to me, as if waiting for me to conclude the thought. It struck me then, and a cold chill slithered down my spine. "Please don't let it get me," I answered, and Grandpa nodded solemnly. The two of us just fell silent for a while, contemplating the disturbing story before he spoke again. "There's a phrase I've heard before, maybe you have too. Hurt people. Hurt people. People that have been traumatized will traumatize others. Maybe that's what these things we call demons are. Trauma that takes on a life or existence of its own." He paused, and I contemplated his words once more. It was a frightening thought, but I haven't the faintest clue how these things work, so maybe he's right. It's the best explanation I can think of, but what do I know? I've screwed up my own life enough that maybe I'm just trying to not hate myself. His eyes seemed to gloss over, and his lips trembled. He seemed like he so desperately wished to pour his heart out, and for once be vulnerable. But as always he didn't. "Good talk, bud. Don't stay up too late." That was all I got, his last parting words before taking his leave. It was the last conversation we ever had, but his words have been with me ever since. I didn't know what to make of his story, but he sure seemed to put a lot of stock in it. It horrified me knowing what he was a part of, but I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised. I'm sure there's all sorts of nefarious experiments and trials in the past. But that's not really what this account was for. Grandpa was a complicated man who lived a complicated life. I never knew him well, but I am glad I got to know him a little bit. It makes his sour demeanor throughout the years a little less imposing. and shed some new light on why he was the way he was. I just hope he found some peace before the end. But after what I heard, I'm not sure it worked out that way. Grandpa passed away a few weeks after my grandmother did, so I suppose he was right when he shared those words with her. I heard from my aunt later that he'd been found in his favorite chair. A cup of coffee beside him with a single piece of paper in his lap etched in a simple handwritten phrase which rattled me to my core. Please don't let it get me. Story. There's a dark truth connecting three 1980s upstate New York murder cases. This comes from someone who claims to be a former forensic investigator that worked for a few precincts in upstate New York. To clarify, I have no personal ties to this person. Don't know why they specifically reached out to me, or felt this page was their only remaining option to tell their story. I'm simply passing along what they said and will leave it to your own interpretation. After conducting my own research, however, I will say their theories are plausible, and whoever this is genuinely believes they've uncovered something heinous. Here's the account I received, told in their point of view. I worked as a forensic investigator in New York State's Delaware and Columbia counties. I've seen my fair share of crime scenes. From child suicides at ages they had no business of even entertaining such thoughts, to gruesome accidents and murder victims killed in the worst ways imaginable. There were three particular cases whose backstories compelled me to dig deeper. Even after the official investigations concluded, what I found made me question the extents of reality, human depravity, and avarice. The first happened in East Chatham, December 1986. A teen, who I'll refer to as Will, murdered 4 of his family members, seeming to be driven by financial gain. All 4 bodies were discovered in their bedrooms, dying from gunshot wounds to the head. Despite being described as a shallow, detached individual, Will excelled in school and was thought to have a bright future. His family was very active in the community and owned a successful business, which made these murders especially stunning. The teen readily confessed when questioned, but wasn't very forthcoming on certain crime scene details. Dozens of candles placed on top of coins scattered around the house. Inscriptions written in blood on the living room floor, most of which we couldn't document because they were repeatedly tracked over before we arrived. And the bodies all being smeared with an oily light green substance. The coroner reports on all 4 bodies described their wounds as narrow, bullet-shaped holes entering through the victim's forehead and exiting through the back. The exit wounds looked nothing like those made by bullets. No casings or rounds were found, and tests for gunpowder residue were incidentally damaged at the lab by a pipe burst. While the official report said all 4 victims died from gunshots, it was technically never proven. Thinking they had sufficient evidence, detectives saw no need to investigate further after Will confessed, and overlooked these bizarre details. Although they determined Will, who claimed to have no recollection of that night, suffered a psychotic breakdown, I always suspected he had an ulterior motive. Any attempts at deciphering what was written on the living room floor were futile, except for one semi-legible phrase, JUDOC. The light green slippery substance slathered on all 4 bodies was also identified as money oil, an herbal remedy used in witchcraft that supposedly brings prosperous wealth. Although many acknowledged there was a lot more going on, Everyone ultimately wanted to move forward and minimize the attention East Chatham was receiving from this tragedy. In the end, I understood the desire to put this dark chapter of East Chatham's history behind us, and eventually accepted I wouldn't learn any more about what happened than what was already known. Fast forward a few years later, when I was working in Delaware County. The second case happened in June 1989, another mass murder that conjured up memories of East Chatham. A 23-year-old, I'll call Evan, murdered his family at their cabin outside Stamford. Lit candles placed on top of coins littered the home, where 4 bodies were found in the house's attic, initially perceived as gunshots. The autopsy report explained their wounds as being bullet-shaped entrances that went completely through the victim's body. Unlike the East Chatham killings, these murder victims contained several deep perforations. The bodies were centered around a strange symbol that seemed to depict a blocky, crookedly drawn, uppercase B, a small backwards J, protruded from the B's lower left corner, while a jagged uppercase T branched off its top left end. The emblem was drawn with a scorched powder that, based on samples recovered, had an initial light green color, and was composed of different herbs. It looked like Evan had been interrupted in the middle of whatever he was doing, prompting him to flee. He was cornered at an abandoned farm in a neighboring county, which ensued a lengthy standoff, before being gunned down after opening fire on police. Officers on scene recalled, Evan kept screaming he was so close, needed to complete the circle, and finish the process. One bizarre piece of evidence was a black envelope Evan pinned on his family's business storefront sometime after committing the murders. It was covered in green wax and contained burnt remnants of paper that, from what few strands were salvaged, appeared to be some kind of letter or note. Although Evan apparently had severe mental issues, this dismissive explanation for his appalling actions disregarded some alarming details. Evan was apparently obsessed with money and wealth, to the point where it influenced him at a cognitive level. He stood to assume his entire family's estate, which, according to friends of his, Evan incessantly pondered about the liquid value of, and what he'd do with all that cash. When I disputed the investigation's conclusions, my police chief gave a familiar explanation. Evan's dead, he said. No need to allocate time and resources to an already solved case. Even after noting every similarity with the East Chatham murders, he wouldn't entertain any further inquiries, and eventually reassigned me to another division. It was after this I learned the powdery substance found in the attic was identified as money powder, which had many similar vegetal ingredients as its oleaginous counterpart, money oil, despite violating orders and an abundance of department codes. I started my own secret investigation trying to connect these cases. There was too much overlap between them that I couldn't let this go without leaving no stone unturned. Both killings were committed by young men with financial motives. They murdered their families in near identical manners. Candles placed on top of coins and substances made from the same materials were found at both crime scenes. Although I was convinced Will and Evan were trying to perform the same or closely related rituals, my evidence was circumstantial at best. I needed a direct link connecting them that would give my theory the credence necessary to be taken seriously. About a year into my independent probe, a case from February 1988 in Groveland, New York was brought to my attention. A man, I'll call Larry, murdered his whole family before committing suicide and setting their house on fire. After extinguishing the blaze, police discovered 5 bodies. Larry killed his wife and 3 children, who were each found lying in their beds. Although gunshots were officially deemed all 5 victims' causes of death, Larry was the only one described as being explicitly caused by a firearm. His wife and kids died from what the documents described as wounds closely resembling a gunshot that completely passed through the victim's cranial region. For me, there were 2 affirming details in this case that connected to the East Chatham and Stamford killings. Investigators determined the fire was started by lighting a charred black envelope. The note inside was too badly burned and no longer legible, but this envelope looked exactly like the one Evan pinned on his family's storefront. Larry also had a tattoo on his back matching the symbol found at the Stamford scene, a jagged B with a smaller uppercase T and backwards J stemming from its corners. I also discovered Larry and his wife were having marital problems, which derived from a crippling financial situation that put them on the precipice of ruin. Finding this case led to more chilling discoveries. One regarded an owl rope bracelet with a gold wolf head charm Larry had on his wrist. Will wore the exact same bracelet when he was found, which I neglected to mention earlier. Despite living in Groveland when murdering his family, Larry settled there fairly recently, having lived most of his life in Schoharie County. Not only did he own a business in East Chatham from 1983 to 1985 where Will happened to work for 8 months, but the abandoned farmhouse where Evan made his final stand was on land formerly owned by Larry's family. I delved further into Larry's background. Although information was hard to come by, it led me to learning about lupus viridis, meaning green wolf in Latin. What little I found described them as some kind of fraternal order, where Larry was a member. The only other details I uncovered about lupus viridis was they were formerly headquartered in a now abandoned lodge located somewhere between Medusa and South Westerlo, roughly the midway point between East Chatham and Stamford. The lodge burned down in the summer of 1989, after which the organization appeared to cease operations. The former lodge's dilapidated remains still stand today. I spent months trying to uncover more about lupus viridis, but had stagnant progress, and came to a barrage of dead ends. Shortly after, however, my rogue investigation was halted after being discovered by the DA's office. Although no charges were pressed, the police confiscated most of my documents and case files, after which I was swiftly terminated. A few years passed, when something seemingly out of the blue happened that dragged me back down this rabbit hole. I woke up one morning to find hundreds of papers, which came from a filing cabinet filled with old files I still had on these cases that the police somehow missed, littering the room where they were kept. Written on every one of those papers was a 6-letter word: Mammon. It was written in what appeared to be blood, and I initially neglected to mention the filing cabinet holding these old documents was in my bedroom. I couldn't let anyone know these files were still in my possession. So I took to the internet, where I gained a lot of perturbing insight on this word's meaning. Mammon was a theological demonic entity representing greed and want, who promised its worshippers boundless wealth. I almost fell over after first seeing Mammon's sigil, a distorted B with an uppercase T and backwards J jutting from its upper and lower left corners. It was the same symbol found in Will's attic and tattooed on Larry's back. This led me to read up on the different rituals for summoning Mammon. They varied in complexity and many involved using specific items like candles, coins, owl rope, herbal remedies like money oil and powder, along with writing letters and requests to Mammon that you burn or place in black envelopes. I was especially bothered by a redundant detail of Mammon's appearance that was in quite a few visual depictions of the being. Many had Mammon brandishing a long narrow spike that retracted from its wrist, which was used to impale its victims' bodies. The stories I read said Mammon extract people's souls in this grisly manner, which were added to a collection it amassed over the millennia. It made me think about the wounds every one of those cases' murder victims had, which every report was quick to write off as gunshots. What else could create that type of opening? Were those poor souls truly at rest, or suffering a far worse fate? Mammon also apparently frequented the form of a wolf, which made sense of the fraternal order being named Lupus Verdes and those owl rope bracelets worn by Will and Larry having wolf head charms. I also don't think the dates all three massacres occurred were randomly chosen. Will killed his family on December 13th, when the feast of Saint Judoc is held. Judoc, the word we found written at the East Chatham crime scene, was a young wealthy prince who gave up his opulence to become a priest. He lived a life of modesty, solitude, and was said to be a staunch adversary of Mammon, since he stood against everything the demon represented. Apparently, using blood to write names of you or your deity's antagonists is a form of mockery and scorn in occultism that supposedly appeases and empowers your idol. The Stamford murders happened on June 22nd, which falls on the summer solstice, whose signified period of growth is considered an opportune time to summon certain beings. And when the season of Mammon begins. Larry's murder-suicide occurred on February 28, 1988, which fell on a leap year. In the dark arts, leap years are supposed to provide a window for spirits and other beings to enter our world. It's worth mentioning many works I read about or mentioned Mammon described him coming in and out of our world using these leap year portals. Having presented my facts, I'll now tell you what I believe happened. Lupus Verdes was secretly a cult dedicated to Mammon, whose members sought wealth and prosperity. Some rituals for summoning this being, say, flesh and blood offerings, yielded greater rewards, based on enormity, if done correctly and precisely. I suppose the magnitude of sacrificing one's family was thought to yield endless rewards from this being. Larry recruited Will and Evan, who became indoctrinated by the order's teachings. My guess is, Will failed to properly complete his ritual, causing him to undergo an irreversible mental breakdown. Evan appeared to have gotten interrupted while performing his, likely by police when they arrived at the house. Larry's situation was less clear. He was overcome with grief either for botching or coming to grips on what he was actually doing during his ritual. and ended his life in response. After how much publicity the Stamford killings got, Lupus Verdes probably decided to vacate the area or go underground, which could explain why their lodge burned. I expectedly made waves when trying to get my findings reviewed and investigate whether Lupus Verdes was still operating. I should have seen it coming, but anyone who even gave me the time of day dismissed my report, saying the evidence was too disputable, circumstantial, and, most insulting of all, inventive. I eventually gave up when my former precincts threatened me with legal action for not turning over all the files and documents I still had. Who said I was rehashing settled business that had no need to be revisited? Things settled down for a while afterwards, until something that happened recently. I found a familiar-looking black envelope among some of my spouse's belongings, while clearing out a room that we were renovating. After reading the recently dated letter it contained, I now know I'm not safe in my home, and have been closely watched by people I've known and loved for years on behalf of a certain aforementioned organization. I don't know who to trust or where I'll go, but hope making my story known will help anyone that is, or suspects they're in a similar situation. This goes way deeper than expected, and those cases I used to put this puzzle together may only be the beginning of uncovering what other horrors this entity and its devout followers have committed. Story. When I was a kid, my dad kept a second family in our basement. Growing up, I thought everyone had a second family in their basement. In retrospect, I understand how ridiculous that sounds, but it was all I'd ever known. I knew that every night, my dad tented the leftovers from dinner with foil, got up without a word, and carried the plate to the basement. I'd listen from my room as he lumbered down the creaking steps, held my breath to hear the muffled mumblings of his greeting. I knew that every morning, he'd make the trip downstairs to see his second family off before work, then kiss me on the top of my head and ruffle my hair as he walked out. I knew that each Christmas, he'd bring a sack of brightly wrapped packages downstairs in a Santa suit. I knew that my dad had a second family in the basement, and it seemed so normal that I thought everyone else did too. I'll never forget the first time I asked my mom about them. I was young, maybe 5, when I finally found the words to ask, "Mommy, why can't I play with the people in the basement?" My mom was the human embodiment of frenetic energy, an organic perpetual motion machine, always pacing, or cleaning, or stirring a pot, always with a lit cigarette tucked between her yellowing fingers. I'll never forget that, as that question hung in the air, she finally stopped for the first time. Her stillness was unsettling in a way I can't quite explain. "We don't talk about them," she rushed, chasing the hurried statement with a lengthy drag off her cigarette. She blew a plume of smoke out the opened window before leaning down to meet me at face level, her bloodshot eyes mere inches from my own. "You don't need to play with the kids, but the kids need Daddy." She paused again, the haunting image of her at a standstill etching itself into my mind permanently. Finally, she muttered, "Daddy needs them too." That night, I heard my mom shrieking at my dad in their bedroom. I was surprised that they didn't know that I knew. More shocked, frightened, even, to find that they didn't want me to know. Most of all, they didn't want me to tell anyone at school, anyone at all. Really, after that night, everything was different. My dad only tented the leftovers after dinner. Only brought the food downstairs after I'd gone to bed. He stopped visiting them in the mornings altogether. My mom started acting differently. 2. I'd always noticed that she was distant from my dad. Had always noticed how she bristled under his touch. How she stole away to the other side of the room whenever he entered. But it got worse after that. As a kid, I felt deeply guilty. I felt like I'd ruined my parents' marriage. But I was just a kid. And I was curious. My mom meant to dissuade me from asking more questions. But she accidentally gave away something that made me even more curious. The downstairs family had kids. Maybe kids my own age to play with. I needed to know about them. In the way that little kids need to understand all of the strangeness of this chaotic world. Need to make sense of the nonsense that surrounds us daily. The nonsense that we become acclimated to as adults but struggle with endlessly as children. Like a puzzle or a riddle or a word problem on a math test about buying 80 watermelons. Another change following that critical night. The basement door was fitted with sturdy lock. Even still, I needed to know. There's something horribly dreadful about finding out that a second basement family is abnormal. Something more horrible still about not knowing who or why. By the time I was 7, I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it. To avoid getting in trouble, I could only investigate when 3 conditions were met. I was home from school. My dad was still at work. And my mom wasn't around to catch me. These circumstances rarely overlapped, but the first time I came home from school to find that my dad's car wasn't in the garage and my mom's endless movement had driven her to the point of exhaustion. I threw off my shoes and crept to the basement door, quiet in my sock feet. And then, I knocked. It was a quiet knock. For fear of waking my mom from her nap. But it was a knock. Nonetheless, it was more than just a knock. 2. It was an initiation, an invitation, a confrontation of my life's greatest and most terrifying mystery. I jumped when a gentle knock returned from the other side. It was almost immediate, like the person on the other side had been waiting for me. The thought froze me in place for a moment. But I knew I didn't have time to waste. My mouth felt suddenly of sandpaper and chalk. But I leaned into the door to whisper. Hi. It was a little girl. Her voice sweet yet timid. Like testing the keys on a piano for the first time. I'm Ricky. What's your name? A long pause. Lila. My brother's is Isaac, but he doesn't talk so good. But he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready. There's 3 of you down there? She replied simply, as if the entire situation felt as wholly normal for her as it had for me. On the opposite side of the basement door, Daddy comes to visit sometimes. Though, so I guess there's 4. My eyes widened as a flurry of questions began to sprout in my mind. But I heard my mom start to stir in her room. I sped down the hallway and into the playroom. I busied my hands with my toys. But my mind was somewhere else. The sprouts of questions continued to grow rapidly, soon overtaking my thoughts like an unruly patch of weeds. And like weeds, the questions were stubborn, hard to, impossible to get rid of. The roots of the situation and its implication unraveled, stretched through my whole body. Fear planted itself firmly in my belly as I was forced to confront the possibility that I didn't really know my dad. Didn't really know my own family at all. If my dad was Lila's dad, too, what did that mean for me? For my family? And why wasn't she allowed to come out of the basement? Over the next couple years, I stole away to the basement door in those rare moments of freedom. I got to know Lila, got to like her, and eventually even to love her. She was my best friend. As a kid, I was pretty lonely. My classmates shied away from me for reasons I couldn't quite understand. Like something about me was inherently repellent to my peers. I only had one friend at school. And at home, I had Lila. As we spoke more, a never-ending stream of back and forth questioning crammed into the briefest moments of time. We both came to understand the differences between us, between our lives and our circumstances. The differences that at first felt so normal grew bigger and sharper and scarier than either of us could comprehend. The unfairness of it all became impossible to ignore. Lila lamented that she wasn't allowed to go to school, that she couldn't go outside to play or make friends or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac in the summer until the street lamps flickered on and the cicadas started to scream. She even longed for the things I loathed most: homework, rinsing off my dishes after dinner, tidying up my room each Sunday morning. She said she'd lived in that basement all of her life, was probably even born down there. She couldn't remember anything different before being locked up in the cold and musty room. I'm ashamed to admit this, but eventually, I couldn't manage the guilt I felt for living the life Lila never had. Could never have in my mind. I was so young, so naive. I didn't know how to manage the situation anymore. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying. I stopped visiting Lila. No more secret, whispered exchanges. No more quick knocks on the door just to let her know that I was there, that anyone at all was there for her. Days and weeks and months and years trickled by with Lila never quite leaving my thoughts, but with her existence instead compartmentalized, confined to the basement of my own mind. At home, it was harder to keep thoughts of her locked away. When my dad brought her dinner hours past my bedtime, I'd lay awake warm in my bed. Sometimes I'd hear her scream. Sometimes I'd hear the tray clatter to the floor, the plate fracturing on impact. Sometimes I'd hear her crying, awful, painful sobs, while I assembled new Lego sets in the playroom. Sometimes she would call out my name. I'll never forgive myself for this. I hate myself for it. And I deserve to. But I ignored her every time. Worst of all, though, was when she started knocking. I was finishing up my science homework for the day when the first knock came. A quiet knock, but a knock. Nonetheless, an initiation, an invitation, a confrontation. My blood ran cold as I realized where it was coming from, who it was coming from. I hopped on my bike and didn't come home until dinner was on the table. That night, I heard my dad scream back at Lila for the first time. Yelled for her to knock it off with all the knocking. He took care of her little brother and her mom, and that he could only do that if she stayed in the basement. If she stayed quiet. She wasn't persuaded, though, and her knocking only grew more frequent and louder. I was about 10 years old by then, so I had a little more freedom, all the freedom in the world. Compared to Lila, I avoided my house at all costs, only returning in the evenings, where I'd be greeted immediately by the knocking. By then, it was less knocking and more ramming the total weight of her body into the door. My mother took to vacuuming the house obsessively just to cover up the noise. She wouldn't even look my dad in the eye anymore. I imagined the bruises blooming on Lila's shoulder, up and down the length of her arm. If it hurt her, she didn't let on. She didn't stop. Sleep became a distant memory, leaving me dazed and irritable and confused and, most of all, terrified. I began showing up at my school friends', now my only friends', house unannounced just to escape Lila's knocking. His parents clearly didn't like me, and tensions rose between the two of us kids, escalating to a boiling point that ended in a fight. I slugged him in the gut, and he returned with the words that broke me, broke everything. A blow far more powerful than he could have delivered with small hands balled up into fists. My mom says you're a bastard. That your mom's a whore. I had to look up the words in my dictionary when I got home. I had to gather the courage to, once again, ask a difficult question. Mom, am I a bastard? I had to watch my mom lose her momentum. To stop again. I had to watch what little light she had left in her go out. I had to sit there as she left the room. Had to sit there spilling hot tears as the knocking kicked up again. Each powerful thrust against the door racking my mind. A painful reminder that Lila was coming for me. But my mom came back, and she returned with an old newspaper clipping in her hands. Worn at the edges, she held it to her chest as she finally told me the truth about Lila. About Dad's second family in the basement. I was young, but I needed to know. My mom knew it, too. Through choking sobs, she told me about my dad's old family. The one he'd had and made before he met her. The horrible mistake they'd made. The one that gave her the best thing she'd ever had in her life but took away 3 others. About how my dad's old wife was already skating on thin ice. Her cries for help that went unanswered. How when she found out about what my mom and my dad were doing, that what little was left beneath her shattered. About how they couldn't have known. But about the guilt she carried regardless, like a heavy backpack. Mom? Yes, sweetie. But I can never put it down. That Lila was dead, and Isaac, too. That their mom had done that to them. And then did it to herself, too. My dad found them in the basement when he got home from work. That he'd never forgiven himself. And my mom never had either. That when they reappeared back in the basement like nothing had happened. Even after their bodies were taken and buried all those years ago. They couldn't think of anything to do but to give them as normal of a life as possible. Yet another difficult question. But why do they have to stay in the basement? I found out later that evening. When my dad came home from work and unlocked the door, Lila came out of the shadows, and I flinched instinctively as I saw her face for the first time. Saw the gaping hole in her face where her left eye should have been. Isaac was little like Lila said, but the oozing wound to his jaw would have made it nearly impossible for him to speak if he had the chance to grow up. I was scared at first, but I put on my brave face and took Lila by the hand. I played with Lila and Isaac for the first time, shared my toys with them, laughed with them. I didn't meet their mom that day, but I would, years later, once she and Lila and Isaac knew what became of them. She struggled to cope. She doesn't come out often. But I treat her with kindness when she does. The woman I know her as now couldn't imagine doing what she did. My dad's second family still stayed inside, but they were no longer confined to the shadows of the basement after that day. They became less of my dad's second family as we all became one larger family that laughed and played and loved together. I don't live in that house anymore. I'm an adult now, with an enormous appreciation for all of the freedom and opportunities available to me that I once took for granted. I know my family is far from normal, even horrible and horrifying in many ways that I helped to perpetuate as a kid, but it's all I've ever known. I love them, all of them. I still visit whenever I can. For birthdays and for Christmas and for summer vacations. And whenever I do visit, I take a moment to be grateful for the fact that when I knock on the front door, Lila opens it. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.